The opening salvo, Michelle Obama's broadside, and The Coming Storm. In the fluorescent-lit studio of ABC's The View, the unmistakable timbre of Michelle Obama's voice carried weight, born of 8 years in the White House. But today, that measured cadence, once reserved for advocating childhood nutrition and educational opportunity, had sharpened to a political blade, one aimed directly at former President Donald Trump. The audience shifted in their seats as the former First Lady departed from her usual restrained diplomacy. A pathetic loser, she called him, the words hanging in the air like smoke after artillery fire. The studio lights seemed to intensify as she dismantled Trump's deportation policies with surgical precision, each point landing with the calculated impact of someone who had spent years watching political combat from the highest seats of power. "This isn't the Michelle Obama of garden initiatives and when they go low we go high," whispered one producer to another backstage. "This is Michelle Obama unburdened by the constraints of the East Wing." 700 miles away, in the stark white briefing room of Trump's campaign headquarters, Karoline Leavitt watched the segment unfold on a mounted television. At 35 years younger than Obama, Leavitt represented the vanguard of a new Republican archetype, media-trained, battle-hardened, and unyielding in defense of her principle. Her eyes narrowed, almost imperceptibly, as Obama delivered her final blow against Trump's immigration stance. Leavitt didn't reach for her phone immediately. Instead, she watched the segment twice more, studying Obama's delivery, noting the applause lines, measuring the audience reaction. Political combat at this level wasn't about reactive emotion. It was chess, played on the board of public perception. "Get me everything she said about deportation in the last 5 years," she instructed an aide without looking away from the screen. "And find me where she stood when the Obama administration deported 3 million people." Across America, the segment was already fragmenting into digital shrapnel, slicing through social media feeds and news alerts. On conservative platforms, the clip was framed as evidence of Democratic hypocrisy and elitism. Liberal outlets amplified Obama's critique as a rare but necessary breach of post-White House protocol in the face of existential threat. America wasn't just divided. It was living in parallel information universes. In one, Michelle Obama was a brave truth-teller confronting authoritarianism. In the other, she was the embodiment of a political establishment desperate to retain control. In the cavernous conference room of a Fox News studio, producers were already clearing primetime minutes for what they anticipated would be Leavitt's response. "She'll come heavy," predicted one executive. "Leavitt doesn't throw jabs, she throws haymakers." The confrontation brewing between these women transcended their individual roles. Obama carried the legacy of a historic administration and the moral authority of having navigated the racial and gendered minefield of being America's first black First Lady. Leavitt wielded the insurgent energy of a movement that had upended political conventions and channeled the grievances of millions who felt forgotten by the very establishment Obama represented. At Trump Tower, the former president himself had been briefed on the exchange, but remained uncharacteristically silent on social media, a calculated restraint suggested by advisors who recognized that sometimes the most effective response comes from unexpected quarters. "Let Karoline handle this one," one senior advisor had counseled. "Obama's attacking you to elevate Harris. We flip the script when a younger woman dismantles her instead of you." In the gleaming offices of political analytics firms, data scientists watched in real time as engagement metrics spiked around both women. The algorithms were clear. America was investing emotional currency in this confrontation at a rate that exceeded policy debates on inflation or foreign affairs. The personal had become not just political, but commercially valuable. As evening approached, Leavitt sat alone in her office, surrounded by research materials and polling data. Her response would not be improvised but architected for maximum impact. She understood that in the modern political arena, narrative dominance was more valuable than factual superiority. The truth that mattered wasn't what had been said, but what would be remembered. She began drafting her counterattack not as a defense of Trump, but as an indictment of perceived hypocrisy, a frame that would position her not as a surrogate, but as a righteous advocate for consistency in public life. Outside the political war rooms and media citadels, ordinary Americans were already choosing sides, reinforcing tribal identities through likes, shares, and comments. The exchange between Obama and Leavitt was being processed not as a disagreement about policy, but as a referendum on cultural values and national identity. As night fell on Washington, the Capitol's power brokers recognized the approaching storm. This wasn't merely another news cycle skirmish, it was a collision of political generations, ideologies, and visions of America, with two women as the avatars of this deepening national divide. And Karoline Leavitt, her response now crafted and ready for tomorrow's deployment, understood something fundamental. In the theater of modern political combat, timing was everything. Michelle Obama had thrown the first punch. Now, with the nation's attention captured and the former First Lady's words still reverberating, Leavitt prepared to deliver what she believed would be the decisive counterstrike. The battlefield response: Leavitt takes the offensive. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds of Fox News Studio B as production assistants scrambled to prepare for what network executives had already branded the response heard round the political world. In the green room, Karoline Leavitt sat motionless, reviewing her notes one final time, her composure a stark contrast to the frenetic energy surrounding her. Leavitt, 30 years Michelle Obama's junior, had spent the previous 17 hours constructing not merely a rebuttal, but a calculated political counteroffensive. The former First Lady's remarks about Donald Trump had landed with the weight of a political heavyweight, but Leavitt was about to demonstrate why Trump had selected her as his administration's public voice. "We're live in 3 minutes," a producer announced, barely glancing up from his clipboard. Leavitt nodded, the slight movement betraying none of the strategic calculus running behind her eyes. This wasn't just about defending her boss, it was about establishing herself as the vanguard of a new conservative archetype that could go toe-to-toe with Democratic royalty. The red light blinked on, and America witnessed the transformation. Gone was the preparatory stillness, replaced by a poised combatant whose opening salvo was delivered not with the raw emotion of the politically wounded, but with the precision of someone who had mapped every possible vector of the coming exchange. "Let me be perfectly clear about something," Leavitt began, her voice resonating with controlled intensity that belied her youth. While Michelle Obama was speaking from the comfort of media adoration, delivering rehearsed lines about a presidency she conveniently mischaracterizes, Americans living in border communities were dealing with the real-world consequences of policies her husband's administration championed, and the current administration has amplified. In newsrooms across America, producers instantly recognized the narrative judo at play. Leavitt wasn't merely defending Trump. She was reframing the entire conversation, positioning Obama's critique as elitist disconnection, while simultaneously invoking the Obama administration's own complex history with immigration enforcement. The 3 million deportations that progressive outlets had once termed the deporter-in-chief legacy. The American people deserve truth, not theatrical political performances. Leavitt continued, her cadence building toward what media trainers call the memorable moment, the soundbite designed to outlive the interview itself. President Trump's policies weren't born of animosity, but of the fundamental belief that sovereign nations require secure borders. The same belief, I might add, that the Obama administration acted upon when politically convenient, before memory became selective and principle became partisan. On social media, the response was immediate and fractured along now familiar lines. Conservative channels erupted with acclaim for what they termed Leavitt's fearless dismantling of Democratic hypocrisy. Progressive platforms countered with frame-by-frame analyses, attempting to fact-check Leavitt's assertions, even as the emotional impact of her performance rendered such technical exercises largely irrelevant to the broader audience. In a downtown Washington strategy firm, a veteran political consultant who had advised 3 presidential campaigns watched the exchange with professional admiration. "This," he told his associates, "is the evolution of political communication. Obama threw the traditional playbook at Trump. Leavitt just showed us how the next generation fights these battles, by rewriting the rules of engagement entirely." The generational dimension of the confrontation wasn't lost on cultural observers. While Obama represented the measured approach of an establishment that believed in certain unwritten rules of political decorum, Leavitt embodied a cohort raised in the crucible of social media combat, where effectiveness was measured in engagement, rather than adherence to traditional norms. "What we're witnessing," noted one prominent political psychologist on a cable news panel, "is not just ideological conflict, but a collision of political epistemologies, different understandings of what constitutes truth, power, and legitimacy in public discourse." By mid-afternoon, the White House press corps was already pressing for the administration's response to Leavitt's counteroffensive. The press secretary's careful non-answer, "We don't comment on every statement from former administration officials," only underscored the effectiveness of Leavitt's approach. By refusing to engage directly, the administration had ceded the narrative battlefield. At Mar-a-Lago, Trump himself had watched Leavitt's performance with rare silent approval. She did what needed to be done, he told advisors afterward. She made it about their hypocrisy, not my policies. As evening approached, focus groups assembled by both parties were delivering their initial findings. Among swing voters, the exchange had produced a curious effect. Rather than shifting overall opinion on either Trump or Obama, it had reinforced existing perceptions while simultaneously elevating Leavitt's profile as a formidable political communicator. She didn't just defend Trump, one independent voter from Pennsylvania told researchers, she made Obama look like yesterday's news. The confrontation between Leavitt and Obama had transcended its immediate subject matter, becoming instead a proxy battle in America's ongoing cultural realignment, a struggle not just over policy, but over who holds narrative authority in an increasingly fragmented information landscape. As darkness fell over Washington, strategists in both parties recognized that tomorrow's political battlefield had been irreversibly altered. The established powers of Democratic politics had deployed one of their most respected voices against Trump, only to find that the response came not from Trump himself, but from a new generation of conservative communicator who had studied their playbook, identified its vulnerabilities, and executed a counter-strategy with devastating efficiency. In her hotel room that night, Leavitt received a text message from a senior campaign advisor. "First round goes to you. They'll come back harder next time." She didn't respond immediately. The real victory wasn't in winning a single news cycle, but in demonstrating that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Michelle Obama had spoken with the authority of history. Karoline Leavitt had responded with the confidence of those determined to rewrite it. The new battlefield. Leavitt's calculated counterstrike against Obama. The studio lights of CNN burned with unforgiving intensity as Karoline Leavitt and Michelle Obama took their positions opposite one another. Two political forces separated by a generation, but united in the understanding that this confrontation would resonate far beyond the confines of cable news. The network producers, sensing the historical weight of the moment, had orchestrated the staging with deliberate precision. The former First Lady's elegant poise contrasted against the sharp, ready stance of Trump's chosen voice. As the cameras went live, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Obama, wielding the gravitas accumulated through years as a Democratic standard-bearer, had arrived prepared to deliver what many in her circle believed would be a definitive rebuke of the former president. But what waited across the table was not the traditional Republican response, deferential, measured, apologetic, but something altogether more calculated. "Mrs. Obama speaks about dignity in politics," Leavitt began, her voice carrying none of the hesitation one might expect from someone facing political royalty, while simultaneously ridiculing a former president of the United States with language that undermines the very standards she claims to uphold. The first exchange sent ripples through the control room. This wasn't going to be the respectful political theater the network had anticipated. Leavitt wasn't playing by the established Washington rulebook. She had come armed with something more potent than talking points. She had brought a completely different understanding of the battlefield. "Your husband's administration built the very facilities you now condemn," Leavitt continued, her words slicing through Obama's carefully constructed narrative framework. "The American people recognize selective outrage when they see it." Obama's momentary silence, less than a second, but an eternity in television time, told seasoned political observers everything they needed to know. The former First Lady had entered, expecting to face the Republican establishment's traditional defense. Instead, she found herself confronted by a new political archetype. Unburdened by deference to historical pecking orders, immune to the social cues that had governed political combat for generations. "I think we can discuss policy without personal attacks," Obama finally responded, attempting to reclaim the higher ground. But the subtle shift in her posture, the slightly straightened spine, the recalibration of her approach, betrayed the recognition that she was now fighting on unfamiliar terrain. In living rooms across America, the confrontation triggered immediate polarization. Conservative viewers saw something revolutionary in Leavitt's approach, not just the substance of her arguments, but the willingness to confront Democratic political aristocracy without apology. Progressive audiences, meanwhile, watched with mounting concern as Obama struggled to regain control of an exchange that had been designed to showcase her moral authority. "The politics of personal destruction didn't begin with Donald Trump," Leavitt pressed, her cadence accelerating slightly as she sensed advantage. It began with a political establishment that decided certain Americans were deplorable for questioning policies that had failed their communities for decades. In newsrooms and political strategy offices, analysts noted the generational dimensions unfolding in real time. Obama represented the careful, managed communication style of traditional politics, where certain boundaries remained sacrosanct even in disagreement. Leavitt embodied the discourse of a generation forged in the unfiltered combat of social media, where effectiveness trumped decorum, and traditional power structures held little inherent authority. "We're not just watching a policy disagreement," whispered a veteran Democratic strategist to his colleagues as they watched the broadcast. "We're witnessing the collapse of the old rules of engagement." As the exchange intensified, Obama attempted to pivot to policy specifics, a terrain where she held distinct advantages, but Leavitt consistently redirected to broader themes of hypocrisy and double standards, forcing Obama to defend not just her positions, but the legitimacy of the entire establishment she represented. "The American people deserve better than lectures from those who enjoyed the privileges of power while implementing the very policies they now condemn," Leavitt asserted, her final statement landing with the precision of a political operator who had mapped every possible response and counter-response. In the aftermath, media coverage split along predictable lines. Fox News framed the exchange as nothing short of a revolutionary moment, when the new guard of conservative communicators displayed the courage to challenge previously untouchable Democratic figures. MSNBC described it as a troubling departure from respectful political discourse. But in both analyses lay the unspoken recognition. Something fundamental had changed in the ecosystem of American political confrontation. What Leavitt demonstrated wasn't just a defense of Trump, noted one political scientist on a late-night panel. It was a declaration that the next generation of conservative communicators won't be bound by the traditional hierarchies that have governed these exchanges. In the White House Situation Room, senior advisors gathered to assess the fallout. The internal polling was unambiguous. While neither woman had shifted overall public opinion significantly, Leavitt had succeeded in neutralizing what should have been a damaging attack from one of the Democratic Party's most popular figures. More concerning for the administration's strategists was the recognition that Obama, long considered politically untouchable, had been effectively countered by someone who represented a new model of Republican communication. She didn't just hold her ground against Michelle Obama, a senior Republican strategist told donors in a private call that evening. She redefined what's possible in these confrontations. As the media cycle churned into its next revolution, both women retreated to assess and recalibrate. For Obama, the exchange represented a sobering reminder that the political landscape had shifted beneath her feet. For Leavitt, it was confirmation that her approach, direct, unapologetic, unburdened by traditional Washington power dynamics, could effectively challenge even the most established Democratic figures. The true significance, however, lay not in these specific arguments exchanged, but in what the confrontation revealed about American political culture, a widening generational and ideological gulf, where even the most basic assumptions about authority, respect, and the rules of engagement no longer held common currency. As night fell on Washington, the question hanging over the political establishment wasn't who had won the day's exchange, but whether the confrontation between Leavitt and Obama represented an anomaly or a preview of a fundamentally transformed political battlefield, one where the accumulated weight of tradition and institutional respect no longer conferred the advantages they once did. In their respective camps, both women prepared for the inevitable next round. But the terrain on which that confrontation would take place had been irrevocably altered, leaving both the old guard and the new to navigate a political landscape where the maps were still being drawn. Armed with data, Leavitt's statistical offensive against Obama. As the confrontation between Leavitt and Obama intensified, the dynamic shifted dramatically from rhetoric to raw numbers. The young press secretary, prepared for this precise moment, reached beneath her lectern and extracted a folder stamped with official government seals, a visual power move that momentarily silenced the studio. "While Mrs. Obama speaks about compassion," Leavitt began, her voice steady as she precisely arranged documents before her, "the data tells a different story about the administration she championed." The camera caught Obama's momentary tensing, a political veteran recognizing the unmistakable prelude to an evidence-based offensive. Leavitt methodically unleashed her statistical barrage, each figure landing with calculated precision. Under the previous administration, which you celebrated and defended, border apprehensions averaged 563,000 annually. Under President Trump, before pandemic restrictions, that number dropped by 30%. She paused, allowing the numbers to resonate with viewers at home who craved quantifiable measures of policy success. "These aren't Republican talking points, Mrs. Obama," Leavitt continued, gesturing toward her documentation. "These figures come directly from your husband's Department of Homeland Security." The control room producers, sensing the shift in momentum, split-screened the broadcast to capture both women simultaneously. Obama's practiced composure against Leavitt's data-driven intensity. Conservative viewers across the country leaned forward in their seats, witnessing something rarely seen in modern political discourse: a direct, statistical challenge to the Obama legacy delivered without apology or equivocation. The same administration that built detention facilities, now condemned as inhumane, processed over 2.7 million deportations, more than any previous presidency, Leavitt noted, her cadence accelerating slightly. "The American people deserve consistency, not selective outrage, when politically convenient." Obama, accustomed to deferential treatment even in disagreement, appeared momentarily caught between defending her husband's record and maintaining her carefully cultivated image of being above partisan combat. The hesitation lasted mere seconds, imperceptible to casual viewers but glaringly evident to political strategists monitoring the exchange. "Policy challenges are complex," Obama finally responded, attempting to recalibrate. "Numbers without context. Context is precisely what's missing from your criticism of President Trump," Leavitt interjected, something unheard of in traditional political etiquette when addressing a former First Lady. "When your husband implemented identical policies, they were described as necessary measures. When President Trump continued them, suddenly they became moral catastrophes." In strategy rooms across Washington, political operatives recognized they were witnessing a generational inflection point in political communication. Leavitt wasn't merely defending Trump. She was systematically dismantling the selective historical framing that had protected Democratic policies from the same scrutiny applied to Republican initiatives. The documentation shows that under the previous administration, family separations occurred over 1,800 times without media coverage or moral condemnation from your platform. Leavitt continued, each statistic reinforcing her central thesis of institutional hypocrisy. The carefully constructed narrative that had positioned the Obamas as politically unassailable guardians of compassionate governance was being methodically deconstructed by a spokesperson half Michelle's age, armed with the former administration's own data. In conservative circles, Leavitt's performance represented a seismic shift, proof that the new generation of Republican communicators could effectively challenge Democratic royalty with substantive arguments rather than mere rhetoric. Progressive strategists, meanwhile, scrambled to understand how they'd lost control of what should have been familiar terrain. "Mrs. Obama, these statistics reflect human lives and communities," Leavitt said, pivoting from numerical assault to moral framing, a tactical move that denied Obama exclusive claim to the humanitarian high ground. "When you condemn policies your family once implemented and defended, you're not just being inconsistent, you're dismissing the legitimate concerns of Americans who live with the consequences of those decisions." The broadcast cut to commercial, with neither woman having conceded ground, but political analysts immediately recognized the exchange's significance. Leavitt had accomplished something previously thought impossible. She had forced Michelle Obama into defending policies rather than simply embodying values. "What we just witnessed," a CNN commentator noted as analysis began, "was the emergence of a new Republican communications strategy, one that refuses to concede moral authority to Democratic figures regardless of their personal popularity." As viewers processed the confrontation, a fundamental question lingered. Was this merely an isolated tactical victory, or the first engagement in a broader conservative strategy to reclaim narrative control through precisely deployed data rather than defensive posturing? Either way, the dynamics of political confrontation had shifted. Michelle Obama had entered expecting to deliver judgment. Instead, she found herself facing judgment, backed by her own administration's statistics. Across America, a generation raised on data visualization and fact-checking processed the exchange differently than their parents. For them, Leavitt's approach represented something refreshingly substantial in a political ecosystem often dominated by emotional appeals detached from measurable outcomes. As both camps prepared for the inevitable next phase of the confrontation, one thing became clear. The established rulebook governing interactions between Republican spokespersons and Democratic standard-bearers had been permanently rewritten. The question now was, who would adapt more effectively to the new battlefield? Those who had written the old rules, or those determined to establish new ones? The human cost, Michelle Obama's counteroffensive, The temperature in the room shifted as Michelle Obama straightened her posture, her eyes reflecting not the defensiveness Leavitt had anticipated, but something more calculated. A veteran's recognition that the battlefield had changed from statistics to stories. The former First Lady had weathered political storms long before Leavitt's career had begun, and her response emerged not as a retreat, but as a strategic pivot. "Numbers without faces are convenient," Obama began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had made her one of the most influential First Ladies in modern history. "But policy isn't spreadsheets, it's people." The studio lights caught the subtle adjustment in her expression, the transformation from defensive respondent to moral narrator. Obama was reclaiming the terrain that had long been her strength, the humanization of political discourse. "When we talk about immigration numbers, Ms. Leavitt," she continued, deliberately using the press secretary's title rather than addressing President Trump directly. A subtle power move, not lost on political analysts. "We're talking about Gabriella, who fled domestic violence with her 3-year-old son only to face separation at the border. We're talking about Emmanuel, a medical student whose DACA protection was threatened not because of any crime, but because of a policy designed to appease a political base." Producers tightened the camera on Obama's hands, steady, unwavering, as she opened a small leather portfolio of her own. Not government documents with statistics, but photographs, faces, stories. "These aren't Democratic talking points," Obama echoed Leavitt's earlier phrasing with deliberate precision. "These are American stories that transcend party affiliation." In Republican strategy rooms, advisors recognized the countermove. Leavitt had brought numbers, Obama had brought narratives. The former First Lady was leveraging the emotional intelligence that had made her approval ratings consistently outpace most elected officials. "Every administration faces impossible choices," Obama acknowledged, a tactical concession that disarmed Leavitt's accusation of hypocrisy without accepting its premise. "But there's a fundamental difference between policies implemented with reluctance and those embraced with enthusiasm, between necessary compromises and ideological campaigns, between seeing migrants as statistics to be managed and humans to be respected." Consultants from both parties noted how Obama had sidestepped the statistical trap Leavitt had set. Instead of defending specific numbers, a losing proposition when facing prepared documentation, she had elevated the conversation to values, the territory where she maintained advantage. "The policies you reference were flawed," Obama continued, an admission that caused momentary surprise among Democratic strategists. "But they were implemented with constant internal review and revision. The difference isn't in whether difficult decisions were made, it's in whether those decisions were made with reluctance or relish." Leavitt's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. The press secretary had prepared for a defensive opponent, not one willing to acknowledge imperfection while simultaneously reframing the moral landscape. "When we separated families, and yes, it happened, it was considered a failure of the system, not a feature," Obama said, her voice lowering to force listeners to lean in. "It prompted immediate review, not celebration tweets." The reference to Trump's social media habits, without naming him directly, shifted the conversation precisely where Obama wanted it, from administrative comparison to character contrast. In living rooms across America, the conversation was no longer about percentage decreases in border crossings, but about fundamental approaches to governance. Obama hadn't won the statistical battle Leavitt had initiated. She had changed its parameters entirely. "Behind every policy decision are values," Obama continued, carefully returning each photograph to her portfolio. "The question isn't whether difficult choices were made by both administrations, they were. The question is whether those choices were made with empathy or antipathy, with reluctance or enthusiasm, with humility or hubris." The camera caught Leavitt's fingers tensing around her folder of statistics. Still powerful, but suddenly less relevant in a conversation that had transcended numbers. "Americans deserve consistency," Obama echoed Leavitt's earlier point. "Not in rigid adherence to flawed approaches, but in the values that guide how we implement necessary policies. Not in refusing to acknowledge mistakes, but in how we learn from them." Political commentators would later describe this moment as a masterclass in narrative reclamation. Obama hadn't disputed Leavitt's statistical arsenal. She had simply rendered it incomplete without the human context she alone was positioned to provide. "These stories aren't props, Ms. Leavitt," Obama concluded, her gaze steady. "They're the purpose behind the policies, they're why the details matter beyond partisan point scoring." As the segment drew to its close, neither woman had conceded defeat. But the battlefield had transformed. Leavitt had brought numbers to a narrative fight, only to find Obama had brought both, statistics anchored in stories that resonated beyond political tribalism. The question hanging in the political atmosphere wasn't who had won this exchange, but whether the next segment would return to Leavitt's numerical precision or remain in Obama's realm of moral framing. The ideological collision had revealed something more fundamental than policy disagreements. It had exposed two entirely different conceptions of political communication in an era defined by division. As producers signaled for transition, both women reached for their water glasses, a momentary armistice before the next engagement. The battle for America's political narrative was far from over. A nation divided, the audience fractures as Leavitt and Obama collide. The auditorium crackled with tension as the crowd's unified silence fractured into a kaleidoscope of partisan reaction. On the left side, supporters visibly recoiled at Leavitt's unflinching offensive. On the right, they rose to their feet with approving nods and whispered vindications. The middle rows, those undecided few America's political machinery still fought to claim, sat frozen in a tableau of conflicted expressions, their allegiances visibly shifting with each rhetorical blow. This wasn't merely an audience, it was America itself, physically manifested in this theater of ideological combat. "Did you see that?" a veteran political correspondent whispered to his producer off-camera. The room just became a living electoral map. As Obama's measured response concluded, and Leavitt prepared her counterattack, the audience's behavioral fault lines deepened. Young Republican women leaned forward in their seats, many recording on their phones, witnessing what conservative media would soon herald as the emergence of their generation's new champion, a woman wielding establishment credentials against the establishment itself. These weren't mere spectators, but disciples witnessing conversion moments in real time. Across the aisle, former Obama administration staffers exchanged knowing glances, their expressions a complex mixture of concern and calculation. They recognized the tactical shift in American political discourse, where Michelle Obama's careful policy nuance now faced Leavitt's devastating simplicity, engineered for maximum virality and minimal context. The network's camera director, sensing the audience's transformation into a character of its own, ordered wide shots that captured the room's physical division, a visual metaphor that would dominate tomorrow's political analysis. "Keep that split screen," she commanded. "This isn't just about what they're saying anymore, it's about how America is receiving it." In the production booth, technicians monitored social media metrics exploding across their screens. Hashtags supporting both women competed for trending dominance, their relative positions shifting with each exchange. The digital audience was replicating the theater's physical divide, but at a scale and velocity that would reshape the narrative before either woman had even left the stage. "It's running 8-to-1 engagement for Leavitt on conservative platforms," an analyst reported, but Obama's responses are driving deeper conversation metrics across mainstream channels. Back in the auditorium, security personnel subtly repositioned themselves. What had begun as standard protocol for a high-profile political event had evolved into something requiring heightened vigilance. The emotional temperature of the room continued rising with each exchange. A Secret Service agent at stage right touched his earpiece, nodding slightly at his counterpart across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the escalating tension. In the front row, strategists from both parties furiously documented audience reactions, knowing these responses would shape the preparation for every future encounter between these ideological forces. They weren't watching a debate. They were witnessing a focus group, reacting to two competing visions of America, one rooted in traditional institutional authority, the other in disruptive realignment. "We're looking at the end of the politics of deference," a former Trump advisor texted to his colleagues watching remotely. "Leavitt just proved you can take on an Obama and not just survive but thrive." As the moderator struggled to maintain the predetermined structure of the event, audience members began breaking protocol, nodding visibly, shaking heads, even occasional whispered commentary. The carefully constructed neutrality of the venue had collapsed under the weight of America's partisan gravity. In the reserved media section, journalists who had arrived expecting to document a predictable exchange between political opposites now recognized they were witnessing something more consequential. A generational transfer of power and approach within the Republican establishment played out against the backdrop of Democratic institutional legacy. When the network cut to commercial, the audience, previously instructed to hold applause, broke into competing reactions. What producers had designed as a policy discussion had transformed into a cultural watershed, with Leavitt emerging as either villain or hero, depending entirely on the observer's pre-existing ideological framework. As the lights dimmed slightly for the break, the production team's director made a crucial decision. "When we return, she instructed her camera operators. "I want more audience reaction shots. What's happening in those seats is becoming as important as what's happening on that stage." The confrontation between Leavitt and Obama had transcended its intended format to become something far more revelatory, a mirror reflecting not just two political figures in conflict, but an American public increasingly unable to witness the same event and see the same reality. As the commercial break neared its end, the question hanging in the charged air wasn't who had scored more points, but whether any shared understanding between these divided American tribes remained possible at all. The digital battlefield, aftermath of a political collision. In the hours that followed the debate, the battlefield shifted from the auditorium's charged air to the infinite arena of social media. What had begun as a face-to-face confrontation between Karoline Leavitt and Michelle Obama transformed into something far more sprawling and uncontrollable. A digital referendum on American values, played out in millions of keystrokes across a polarized nation. By midnight, hashtags supporting Leavitt dominated conservative platforms, her name trending alongside phrases like "new conservative lioness" and "Obama takedown." Screenshots of her most cutting responses to the former First Lady circulated with increasing velocity, each share amplifying the narrative of a young Republican woman who dared challenge Democratic royalty and emerged victorious. What we witnessed tonight wasn't just political theater, it was a generational gauntlet being thrown down, remarked a Fox News analyst, whose segment on Leavitt's performance had already garnered over 2 million views. The establishment just met its future, and it's wearing heels. Inside Trump's Mar-a-Lago estate, where former advisors gathered to watch the aftermath unfold, the mood shifted from satisfaction to strategic opportunity. One senior Republican strategist, speaking on condition of anonymity, revealed, "The president called Leavitt personally after seeing the numbers. This wasn't just about defending him, she created an entirely new front in the culture war." Yet across the ideological divide, a counter-narrative was forming with equal intensity. Progressive commentators dissected what they called Leavitt's manufactured outrage, framing her confrontation with Obama as emblematic of a post-truth political landscape where performance trumped substance. What's troubling isn't just the content of Leavitt's attacks, but how they're designed specifically to fracture any possibility of good faith debate, noted a political scientist whose analysis was being shared widely among Democratic circles. This isn't debate, it's demolition. Meanwhile, Michelle Obama maintained public silence, her only response a single cryptic social media post featuring a quote about dignity under fire, a move her supporters interpreted as rising above the fray, while critics claimed revealed her inability to counter Leavitt's accusations directly. Perhaps most revealing was the response among America's younger voters, whose reactions split along lines that transcended traditional partisan boundaries. College Republicans organized watch parties celebrating Leavitt as the face of a new conservatism, unapologetic, media-savvy, and unwilling to defer to established political hierarchies. "She's us," explained the president of Georgetown's Young Republicans. "She's proving you don't have to wait your turn anymore." Yet for many young progressives, the confrontation represented something more ominous, the final extinction of respectful political discourse. "We're watching the deliberate destruction of how Americans talk to each other," lamented a Democratic organizer at Howard University. "And it's working." As dawn broke over Washington, a new reality emerged. This debate's significance lay not in policy positions or traditional political scorekeeping, but in how it illuminated America's diverging realities. In newsrooms across the country, producers faced the impossible task of covering not just a political event, but two entirely different perceptions of what had occurred. "The Leavitt-Obama exchange has become a Rorschach test," explained a media analyst, tracking coverage patterns. "People aren't just disagreeing about who won, they're watching fundamentally different events shaped by their information ecosystems." Perhaps most significantly, internal polling conducted overnight revealed that among undecided voters, that shrinking but crucial demographic, reactions split almost entirely along demographic lines. Older voters, regardless of party, expressed discomfort with Leavitt's confrontational style, while younger voters admired her willingness to challenge an established figure like Obama directly. "What we're seeing isn't just political polarization anymore," noted a veteran campaign strategist reviewing the numbers. "It's divergent conceptions of what political leadership should look like in America." By morning, both women had become avatars in a larger cultural struggle. Leavitt representing a confrontational approach that rejected traditional political norms in favor of authentic expression, Obama embodying institutional poise and measured response in an age of political combat. As White House staff prepared for Leavitt's morning briefing, they monitored the continuing online fallout with strategic interest. The press secretary's performance had transformed her overnight from Trump's spokesperson to conservative standard-bearer in her own right, a development that would reshape power dynamics within Republican circles for months to come. What nobody yet realized was how this single exchange would permanently alter both women's trajectories. For Leavitt, the path forward now contained possibilities that transcended her role as presidential spokesperson. For Obama, it presented a challenge to her carefully cultivated position above the partisan fray. And for an America already struggling to maintain any shared political reality, it offered a troubling glimpse of future confrontations, where victory would be measured not in persuasion, but in the destruction of opposition legitimacy itself. The aftershock, Leavitt's rise and the reshaping of political battle lines. In the days following the explosive confrontation, Karoline Leavitt emerged not merely as Donald Trump's defender, but as a political force in her own right. The aftershocks of her clash with Michelle Obama reverberated through the halls of power, transforming what began as a heated exchange into something far more consequential, a defining moment that would permanently alter both women's trajectories in American politics. By week's end, Republican strategists were quietly discussing Leavitt's newfound political capital. What they saw wasn't just a talented spokesperson, but a potential candidate whose willingness to confront Democratic royalty had electrified the base in ways few had anticipated. What Karoline demonstrated wasn't just loyalty to the president, confided a senior Republican operative, who requested anonymity to speak freely. She showed the ability to distill complex conservative grievances into moments of clarity that resonate beyond traditional party lines. That's exceedingly rare. Within Trump's inner circle, Leavitt's performance triggered a recalibration of influence. Sources close to the former president revealed that her unyielding defense against Obama's criticisms had elevated her status from staff to confidant, a transition few had navigated successfully in Trump's orbit. The president values loyalty above all, explained a former Trump campaign official. But what separates those who last from those who don't is the ability to transform that loyalty into political advantage. Leavitt didn't just defend him, she advanced his narrative while establishing her own. Yet beyond the immediate political calculus lay a deeper significance. Media scholars noted how the confrontation had crystallized the fundamental divide in American discourse between institutional respect embodied by Obama and the insurgent authenticity championed by Leavitt and her generation of conservative women. We're witnessing the collision of two entirely different theories of political communication, observed Dr. Eleanor Winters, professor of political communication at Georgetown. Obama represents the belief that dignity and institutional respect should transcend partisan combat. Leavitt embodies the conviction that such restraint is merely establishment privilege disguised as virtue. As footage from the confrontation continued to circulate, pollsters detected something remarkable. Leavitt's support wasn't confined to traditional Republican demographics. Data showed surprising resonance among voters under 35 across political affiliations, particularly those who described themselves as disillusioned with political theater. There's hunger for authenticity that transcends ideology, noted veteran pollster James Hernandez. For a segment of younger voters, Leavitt's willingness to discard political niceties reads as refreshing honesty, even among those who disagree with her positions. The polling data didn't escape Democratic strategists, who scrambled to understand this newfound vulnerability. Internal memos, later leaked to political journalists, revealed concerns that Obama's measured response, while dignified, had failed to connect with voters seeking emotional catharsis in an age of political frustration. "We can't continue responding to passion with procedure," warned one Democratic memo circulating among party leadership. The language of restraint increasingly reads as the language of disconnection. For Michelle Obama, the confrontation marked a significant inflection point. Her carefully cultivated position above partisan warfare had been forcefully challenged, creating pressure from progressive activists for her to engage more directly in the ideological battles defining the era. "There's growing recognition that moral authority alone isn't enough," explained a former Obama administration official. "The expectation that figures like Michelle can remain above the fray while others fight in the trenches is increasingly viewed as privilege rather than principle." Across cable news and digital media, the confrontation became shorthand for America's divergent political realities. less about the specific exchange than what it represented about the nation's inability to even agree on the terms of disagreement. "We've moved beyond polarization into fragmentation," warned media ethicist Dr. Raymond Chen. "When Americans can't even agree on what constitutes respectful discourse, democracy itself becomes procedurally impossible." As Leavitt prepared for her first press briefing following the confrontation, White House staffers noted a subtle but significant shift in her demeanor. The confidence remained, but there was something new, a gravitas that comes only when one recognizes they've altered the national conversation. "She walks differently now," observed a junior press aide. "Like someone who knows they've made history, not just headlines." What neither woman could fully appreciate in that moment was how their confrontation would reshape the parameters of female political ambition in America. For a generation of women watching from both sides of the ideological divide, the exchange offered a masterclass in how power is claimed, not conferred. Through calculated risk and unwavering resolve, amid the chaos of a nation at war with itself. As spring turned to summer and the presidential campaign intensified, both Obama and Leavitt would find themselves repeatedly asked about that fateful exchange, a moment that had somehow transcended mere conflict to become a reference point in America's ongoing negotiation with its divided self. The question that remained unanswered was whether their confrontation had revealed the impossibility of bridging America's divides, or simply illuminated the new rules of engagement for those brave enough to try.